Hey, I'm Ammon. This is Being in Time 7b, assuming that we allowed numbers and letters to go together in our numbering system, which why not? In my last video, I had sketched out what I was calling a minimalist reading of the thesis of being in time, or the minimalist reading of what Heidegger means when he's talking about the question of being. And in this one, I'm going to sketch out a more maximalist reading. As I mentioned, this is a strategy I'm going to use a lot. I think it's going to be helpful in understanding what Heidegger's up to and also how to sort of wrestle with Heidegger, assuming we want to do that. Which, maybe not be the best thing in the world. But speaking of wrestling, this is also our chance to come back to the gigantomachia. I know that you thought I had forgotten or dropped the shtick about caring about poets and mythology, but the spoiler there, and this is sort of my own spoiler, is I will never stop caring about mythology and poetry. No matter how many videos we go without it, it will be coming back. So remember that on what we're calling a minimalist reading of Heidegger's invocation of Plato and Aristotle here, Heidegger is sort of using them as repeating a gesture, repeating a certain question that he saw Plato and Aristotle taking up, using the question of being or the question of the meaning of being or the question of the truth of being as a way of asking about the totality of what is, how any features of our world fit together, whether or not there's some overarching answer or not. On that reading, Plato and Aristotle are, let's say, somewhat exemplary, but they're only exemplary. Now, we're going to move now, and let's say if we can talk about that in terms of the question of being, let's sketch out another thing which we might call something like the history of being. There's nothing that I can do to stop what's going to come next from sounding like a non sequitur, so I'm just going to try to come out and put the question on the line here. Is that history of being going to be the same as something like, let's say, the history of the West? There's a decent possibility that's the case, and certainly the idea of the West is going to be very important to understanding what we're going to mean when we talk about the history of being. I used to read those Rick Riordan books to my kids, and in those, there's this sort of idea that the Greek gods are around and that they are in some way combined with the idea of the West. In those books, it's kind of presented in a kind of liberal way. You can find there's a lot of ways in which the idea of the West is crucial to the ideology of the Enlightenment, which is at the core of liberalism. Now, if you know anything about Heidegger, that's not going to be the direction he goes with it. As something that we're going to have to talk about, although it's not the case yet in Being in Time, is that Heidegger will, by 1934, openly identify with the Nazi Party. And I'm not trying to just say that fascism is liberalism and vice versa. They're connected, of course, but not quite that simply, right? But the point is that it's a gesture which in philosophy, post-Enlightenment, both among Enlightenment defenders and critics, has a lot of cachet. And, which we should sort of take both very seriously. But part of taking it seriously will mean taking seriously the deeply problematic nature of that kind of assumption. Okay, so that's a pretty big non sequitur, but how do I actually see this going on and being helpful in understanding Being in Time? Certainly it'll be very helpful and important in Heidegger's later work, but is that already present in Being in Time? Well, when Heidegger was calling the way in which Plato and Aristotle wrested the question of being, of the meaning of being from phenomena, incipient, as I believe the way that McCoy and Robinson translated, there is really this sense there, this really strong suggestion that there's some sort of beginning, and that he's trying to sort of repeat that beginning. Remember that the gigantomachy in mythology is a victory of the status quo. And in fact, you could argue that it's only once the status quo has a victory that we can identify it as the status quo. This is sort of, we could go into long bits about history repeating itself, what the hell that means. But noticing in generally that it's only when something's happening again, or when we notice something has already happened, that we can call it a certain kind of phenomenon at all. So when Plato and Aristotle are asking the questions that they're asking, there's going to be a lot of, let's say, chauvinism about the Greek worldview built into it. But they're not going to see, even if they see a sort of distinctive Greekness about it, that distinctive Greekness is not going to undergird something like, let's say, the West, or modernity, or the Enlightenment, all sorts of things which have not yet been invented. There's no non-complicated way to get into how these kinds of questions are going to end up featuring in Being in Time. And I really sort of just want to get them on the radar here. But the crucial thing that I sort of want to notice for now, right, is that there's a sense in which Heidegger already has in here something like a theory of history. And the way in which that history depends upon there being possible answers, that the very way of asking the question about the meaning of being sort of gives to be thought a certain number of possible answers. and working out the question is going to be working out sort of the history of what I think already in 1927 Heidegger is going to think is Nietzsche is in some ways right about, in a piece by Nietzsche that will be crucial to Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, is already in some ways a history of an error. An error has, of course, to do with going astray, with errancy. It has to do with taking the wrong path. And we're going to get into sort of some complicated ideas about what the West is, what's good in the West, what's bad in the West. Are we the proper heirs of the Greeks? Are we the improper heirs of the Greeks? These questions are, of course, going to sound dangerously, to use a word that I'm going to talk some of in the next video when I put some of my own cards on the table, dangerously mythological to some. So here's going to be a question. Is Heidegger's history of being a mythology of being? Now, I'll talk about what I mean by that a little bit more in the next video, but for now I just want to end by pointing out one other thing about this approach. Remember I said that there's no answer to the question of the meaning of being for Heidegger. That's the answer that he's going to want to defend necessarily. That doesn't mean that there's no possible way to answer the question. In fact, remember, that's built into the thesis. Any possible answer will in some way have time as its horizon. And the history of being is going to be the history of those answers, which, Heidegger's going to this is going to become more and more important as Heidegger's thought develops. But already in Being in Time, I think it's important to bear that in mind. This question, even though it's unanswerable, has been answered in lots of ways. And that answer has been decisive to the way in which the world has been shaped. As many criticisms as I'm going to have with Heidegger here, and there are going to be a lot of them, I actually am going to defend this notion as being a useful way of understanding certain features of the history of philosophy.